Hello, welcome to TVLP's SENCO webinar. My name's Natalie Packer and I'm a SEN consultant, and I work with primary and secondary schools across the country and support SEND leadership. The reason that I'm doing this webinar for you is because originally Claire had asked me to come to speak to you at one of your SENCO group meetings. Obviously, because of the current situation as it is, that's not possible. So we decided that it would be helpful if I recorded this webinar for you, and then you can watch it at a point that's convenient for you. Obviously, we're not going to be able to be interactive in the way that we would be if we were doing a face-to-face meeting. Having said that, if there are any questions that you think of that you want to ask that are raised during the webinar, if you then want to keep those questions and pass them on to Claire, and then she can pass them on to me at a later point, and I can get back to you and hopefully try and answer some of those questions. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Okay, so what I'm going to focus on in the webinar is SEND in the inspection framework, in the EIF, the Education Inspection Framework that we now have with OFSTED, and how as a SENCO you can prepare for inspection. Just to make the point that I'm not an OFSTED inspector, however, I was involved in a small way in the consultation around SEND when OFSTED were putting the framework together last year. I also work with a number of different schools and multi-academic trusts across the country, and help schools to prepare for inspections, and also a number of our schools have already been through an inspection under the new framework, so I'll be able to share some of those sort of experiences with you. I kind of acknowledge that the OFSTED and inspection is not necessarily going to be a priority for you right at this moment in time. Lots of other things to be thinking about at the moment in terms of the immediate support for children and people and families. However, having said that, I think that the next few months are potentially a really good time for you just to take some time to reflect on your practice and provision in your school. So hopefully this webinar will help you to do that. I think it's important to make the point that although we have an inspection system that obviously holds us to account, what we do in terms of practice around SEND in our school, we don't do because of OFSTED, we don't do because of the inspection system, but actually we do it because it's the right thing to do for our children. And I'm often asked this question from schools around, how do we prepare for inspection? SENCOs will often ask that question. And I suppose what I would say to that is actually the best way to prepare is to be a continually self-reflecting school. So that as a SENCO, you are in a position to be able to know what's working well in your school and where the areas for development are in terms of SEND. That's what OFSTED will want to know. They'll ask you those questions, and part of the process of the inspection will then be they'll look at their evidence and they'll triangulate their evidence with yours. So just before we sort of go into the framework itself, what I'd like you to do is just to reflect on these two questions. So first of all, thinking about what are the key strengths of SEND provision in your school? So what's working well? How do you know? What's your evidence for that? And how are you using those strengths and sharing good practice wider? And then secondly, what are the key areas for development in terms of SEND practice and provision? And what is it that you're going to do in order to address some of those areas for development? What are your next steps? And is that coming through in terms of your strategic development planning? Now, for some of you, you might be able to answer those two questions really, really easily. For others, you might need a little bit of time to think about that. and I would ask you just to keep reflecting back on those 2 questions whilst you're listening to the rest of the webinar, and also to keep coming back to these questions, share them with other members of SLT when you get an opportunity again to get together as a group of SENCOs, again to reflect on these 2 questions from your own school's perspective. They're quite broad questions, and I think what might be helpful is if we perhaps try to break those down a little bit. What I've got on this slide are 5 key areas of effective whole school SEND provision. So it might be easier to think about those strengths and those areas for development within each of these 5 areas. Now, the reason that I'm sharing this particular diagram with you is this is what I use when I go in to do SEND reviews in schools. So I spend quite a lot of time doing SEND reviews, and a colleague of mine who I work quite closely with, the 2 of us came up with a framework for SEND self-evaluation, and this is basically the framework we use. So when we go into schools, we will talk to SENCOs and to senior leaders about each of these 5 key aspects of effective whole school provision. So we'd start by looking at the whole school leadership and management, and asking questions around how strategic the SENCO is, if the SENCO sits on senior leadership team, what the vision is of senior leaders around SEN, how governors are involved in ensuring that provision is effective. Second aspect we look at is the effective identification, assessment and monitoring, which will include things like the overview of your SEN register and how you analyse that and use that to develop provision. It also includes things like the processes you have in place for early and effective identification and the assessment processes that you use, both in terms of whole school but also specifically for pupils with SEN. Then we look at the curriculum and high quality teaching. So what is the offer for pupils with SEN, and we're going to be talking quite a lot about that in a minute in relation to the inspection framework, and also how the school prioritises high quality teaching, because first and foremost that's what's going to make a difference. The next section we look at is a high quality additional provision and partnerships. So that includes, for example, partnerships with parents and also external agencies. And then lastly, we look at the outcomes. And when we're talking about outcomes, we're not just talking about academic outcomes, we're actually talking about all of those holistic outcomes that are really important for many of our children and young people with SEND. And again, hopefully what you will see when we go through the inspection framework is that holistic approach to outcomes is something that OFSTED focus on as well. So, as I said, I think what would be useful is just for you to really kind of keep in mind those 2 questions around key strengths and areas for development as we're talking about the OFSTED framework, and think about how you can, if you like, gather that evidence and information to show where your strengths and areas for development are, because that's going to be really good preparation for the point at which you are inspected. So here's the framework. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with this by now. There are obviously the four main areas for judgment. I quite like this particular diagram because I think it gives us a real flavour of, if you like, how significant the quality of education judgment is within the EIF. As you can see on the diagram, it's a lot bigger than the other 3 aspects. And within that quality of education judgment, we're looking at the 3 I's, as we refer to them. So the intent, the implementation, and the impact of the curriculum, because so much of this framework is focused on the curriculum offer that schools have for all of their pupils. So we're going to be talking quite a lot about that judgment around the quality of education. We're also going to talk quite a bit about the leadership and management judgment and how SEND fits into that as well, if you like. SEND in the EIF, SEND isn't inspected as a separate judgment. It's very much woven into each of the 4 areas. Although having said that, before making that final judgment on overall effectiveness, inspectors will look first of all at the spiritual, moral, social and cultural development of pupils, and then they'll also evaluate the extent to which the school's education provision meets the needs of different groups of pupils, including pupils with SEND. Just looking at the behaviour and attitudes judgment, when we look at the criteria within the Ofsted handbook, there isn't a lot within that section which refers specifically to pupils with SEND, but what it does say is that if schools working with particular pupils that have specific needs around improving their behaviour, their attendance or their attitudes, then Ofsted might, as part of the inspection, look at that provision. And what they'll be looking for is, does that provision reflect high expectations in terms of behaviour and attitudes? And also, is there a consistent approach to that across the school? Again, in terms of the personal development judgment, there isn't a huge amount that specifically refers to SEN, but what it does say is that inspectors might evaluate the experience of particular individuals for whom a referral has been made to the local authority. So, for example, looked after children, children with special educational needs and disabilities, those who have medical conditions, and also children who may have mental health issues. So where there's likely to be multi-agency involvement, then inspectors might look at the provision for those particular individuals. So, as I say, what we're going to do is focus, first of all, in a minute on the leadership and management, and then also look in quite a lot of detail around the quality of education judgment and what that says in reference to pupils with SEND. There are 3 key documents that we need to be aware of and familiar with. So, first of all, there's the Education Inspection Framework. So this sets out the principles and summarises those 4 main judgments that Ofsted make. Secondly, we've got the School Inspection Handbook, and that sets out how the school will be inspected. So it talks about the process, and then it also goes into detail around the evaluation criteria that inspectors use to make those judgments. And the third document, which is really important for us to be aware of, is the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Statement. Now, there's a lot of people that actually don't know that this exists. It's been, for some reason, a little bit hidden under the radar. But certainly from a SEND perspective, it's a really important document. And what it does is to set out how Ofsted will consider how effectively the school is meeting the requirements within the Equality Act 2010. Right at the beginning of that document, it sets out really clearly a statement about how Ofsted intend to be a force for improving the education available for all learners with SEND. And I think that's really important, which is why I've highlighted it in red there. Genuinely and generally, I do actually believe that that is the case. Certainly from the experiences of schools that I work with, they've been very positive in terms of the focus that Ofsted have placed on SEND, and also the way that they've gone about inspecting SEND and the conversations that they've had with SENCOs and with other leaders. Obviously, different schools have slightly different experiences depending on the inspectors, but generally speaking, so far it's been very positive. Within this particular document, again, Ofsted talk about no provider being placed at a disadvantage simply because they have a high proportion of learners with SEND. And again, that is really, really important. I think that that's in there. In the past, in previous inspection frameworks, what sometimes happened is that schools have been given outstanding judgments when actually we know that they're not necessarily inclusive. In the majority of cases, schools will not be able to get away with that anymore because of what's included within the framework. So, as I say, that is quite a positive thing, really. So Ofsted, they'll be looking at, whether schools are inclusive in terms of admissions processes, checking to make sure that off-rolling is not happening, particularly within secondary schools. Is a big focus for Ofsted at the moment, because that has been an issue in the past, and quite often, where this unlawful practice of off-rolling has happened, it's often involved children, young people with special educational needs or disabilities, not always, but quite often. And they'll also be looking at whether the curriculum is ambitious for all pupils, including those pupils with SEND. And that idea of ambition in the curriculum is a really big one in the framework, and one that we will keep coming back to. So within the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Statement, as I say, this is really focusing on how well the school is meeting their requirements under the Equality Act. So it's looking at how effectively the school ensures that pupils with any of the protected characteristics under the Equality Act are not discriminated against. And that includes children and young people who have disabilities. It's also looking at reasonable adjustments and how well reasonable adjustments are being made for learners with SEND. Now, that term reasonable adjustments it's an important one. It's certainly an important one at the moment in the current situation, because the Equality Act remains in force. It's a really important act, and actually schools still need to be looking at how reasonable adjustments are being made for children and young people with SEND, particularly those with EHCPs, whether they are in school or whether they are at home. But just going back to the Ofsted framework, when we're talking about reasonable adjustments, we're looking at reasonable adjustments in relation to the physical environment, but also reasonable adjustments in terms of how within school we are amending our curriculum, and also adjusting the provision of information to individuals. Now, those three elements, the physical environment, amending the curriculum, and adjusting provision of information, are the three aspects that we need to include within our accessibility plans. So it's important to make sure that your accessibility plan is up to date. I'll just make that comment, because for many people they're not. Sometimes accessibility plans are developed, they're put on a website, and then they're kind of forgotten about. So do have a look at your accessibility plan. Make sure it's on your website for a start, and that it is up to date. If it needs reviewing, that might be something to come back to in the autumn term. The comment here, that's again taken from the inclusion statement, also refers to schools making reasonable adjustments in applying behaviour policies. Now, I think it's really interesting that Ofsted decided to include this specifically, and I think, I don't know for sure, but I think that's probably there because it refers to cases again that have happened previously in schools, where behaviour policies perhaps have been quite fixed and have not necessarily then met the needs of some of our learners with SEND. So just to give you an example, there was quite a high profile academy chain last year that were in the press because, as part of their whole trust behaviour policy, pupils have to give eye contact to any adult that's speaking to them. There was an issue with a particular individual, a particular young person who has autism, who, because of his autism, was not able to do that, and that actually led to the school unlawfully excluding this young person. That's just one example, but I think that's the sort of reasons why Ofsted decided to put that specifically within this statement. When we're talking about reasonable adjustments, I think it's quite important to make sure, first of all, that that governors are fulfilling their requirements, because they've got a responsibility to make sure that the school is meeting their requirements under the Equality Act. So Ofsted might well ask governors that question. So just something for you to reflect on at this point in time is, as a SENCO or as a SEND leader, what evidence have you got that leaders and governors are ensuring that the school is meeting the requirements under the Equality Act? So are the equality objectives published on the website? Is the accessibility plan up to date? And are governors monitoring that? Is there something within the annual report that you do to governors which includes something around the Equality Act and the relevance of the accessibility plan as well? But as well as leaders and governors, I think it's important to make sure that teachers understand their responsibilities under the Equality Act, because it is everybody's responsibility to ensure that reasonable adjustments are made. And one thing, just as a bit of a kind of practical idea really, one thing that I often do when I'm training staff in schools is to talk about what we mean by reasonable adjustments in the classroom. And on this slide, there are 6 particular examples there of what a reasonable adjustment might look like for a class teacher and how they can make those adjustments in their classroom. And what I would ask them to do is to discuss each statement and perhaps identify on a scale of 1 to 10 how confident they felt that they were able to make that particular reasonable adjustment generally for pupils in their classroom. So that's just a little bit of an idea really of something that you might want to share with staff. So just going back to the framework, as I said, these are the 3 documents that we're really focusing on. I'm going to go into detail now about the school inspection handbook and the bits that are particularly relevant to SEND. But what I would say in terms of your kind of preparation for inspection, certainly if you've not seen the equality, diversity and inclusion statement, do start by having a look through that, because it is a very important read. Okay, so those of you who are watching this webinar, you're all SENCOs or leaders of SEND in your school. Quick question, how many of you feel like this on a day-to-day basis? Being SENCO is a little bit like having to spin lots of plates all of the time, isn't it? And trying to stop those plates from falling. And I would imagine that many of you feel that this is particularly the case at the moment with the situation that we're in, where we're in a situation that we've just never been in before, and we're having to really kind of think on our feet and put lots of things in place that we wouldn't have even thought about just a couple of months ago. So if you feel like this even in normal times, rest assured you are certainly not alone. I don't know if any of you will have come across this before, but there was a really interesting survey, or 2 surveys actually, that have been done and published by BASPAR University and NASEN, the National Association for Special Educational Needs. And these surveys have been looking at SENCO workload. So the first one, which was called It's About Time, was published in, I think it was around about November 2018. And then BASPAR and NASEN did a follow-up to the survey last autumn. And that one was called The Time Is Now. And this is the summary on this slide of the kind of the key findings of both of those surveys. So the original survey that was done in 2018, as part of that survey, they interviewed around about 2,000 SENCOs and other SEND leaders. And from that population of people they interviewed, 70% of SENCOs felt that they didn't have enough time allocated to the role. And I can kind of imagine right now that most of you will be nodding to that. That's what usually happens. To be honest, I was actually quite surprised that it wasn't higher than 70%, because it's a really, really tough role. There's so much to it. Not everybody always understands, actually, if you don't do the role, they don't necessarily understand what it actually entails. And the majority of SENCOs, feel that the workload is huge. 78% of those SENCOs said that other roles and tasks routinely pull them away from being able to carry out the role effectively. So I'm sure many of you will have other responsibilities, perhaps as vice principal or as assistant head teacher, or as safeguarding lead, or as whole school inclusion lead. Lots of other roles that you have as well. When they followed up the survey last year, they asked the question again around workload and time, protected time to actually carry out the role, and actually only 17% of SENCOs said that they had more time to do the role than they had previously, but actually 22% had less time. That's quite worrying, because the workload certainly hasn't decreased in the last 12 to 18 months at all, but 22% of SENCOs saying they've actually got less time to carry out the role than they had previously. 96% of SENCOs saying that they should have legally protected time to carry out their role as SENCO. I suppose in the same way that teachers have PPA, there is a recommendation that actually SENCO should have that legally protected time similarly as well, which I agree with. I think that's a really good idea. And just as a bit of an aside, but something that's quite important, is that the DfE had, prior to coronavirus outbreak, had started to do a review of special educational needs, a national review. They were due to publish their findings sometime in the summer term. Obviously that has now been delayed, but the review is still happening. And as part of the consultation for that review, NASEN have given the recommendation to the DfE that this actually happens, that SENCOs have legally protected time. Now, whether that happens or not, I really don't know, but it's certainly been made as a recommendation, again, because it's acknowledged that that time is really, really important, and particularly that priority around focusing on high quality teaching and developing staff skills. Now, all of this is really interesting. How does this link to what we're talking about in terms of the OFSTED framework? Well, actually, the point I want to make here is really specifically about that bottom bullet point there. When the SENCOs were interviewed in the first survey, only 46% said that they felt their role was understood by senior leaders. And when that was broken into primary and secondary, only 26% of secondary SENCOs felt that senior leaders understood their role. Now, for me, that is really, really important, because actually, for those SENCOs who said they felt that their role was understood, even though that didn't necessarily mean their workload was smaller, what they did say was that they generally had a better experience and they felt that the workload was much more manageable. And actually, because it was SEN was seen as a whole school responsibility, it wasn't just up to them as the SENCO to make sure that effective SEN provision was in place. So other leaders have really got a role to play, and that's important for developing that whole school approach to SEND. I just wanted to show you this, which I think really this quote really sums up what I was just saying quite nicely. This is a quote taken from a book written by a friend and colleague of mine, David Bartram. It's called Great Expectations. I would really recommend it as a read if you haven't seen it before. And within that book, he talks about leaders being central to school improvement in every aspect of effective schooling. And if we don't get that commitment at senior leadership level, then actually, it doesn't matter how effective you as an individual SENCO might be, we're never going to get to that point that we really want to in terms of all of our learners with SEND getting that effective provision that they're entitled to. So whole school leadership of SEND is really important. And it is reflected in the inspection framework. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that in a minute. So I said right at the beginning that SEND isn't inspected as a separate judgment within the framework. However, having said that, what Ofsted do acknowledge the fact that there are certain aspects of SEND provision which they need to be looking specifically at and gathering information about as part of the inspection framework. And that's stated here in paragraph 312 in the inspection handbook. And I would say that if you don't take any notice of any other aspect of the Ofsted handbook, that you do take notice of paragraph 312, because this, if you like, is the key bit in terms of reference to SEND in the framework. So within this paragraph, it lays out 8 bullet points altogether of what inspectors will gather and evaluate evidence about. So we'll just have a look at these in turn. First one, whether leaders are ambitious for all pupils with SEND. How well leaders identify, assess and meet the needs of pupils with SEND. How well leaders develop and adapt the curriculum. How successfully leaders involve parents, carers and other professionals. A bit of a theme going on here, hopefully you can see. It talks about leaders, it doesn't talk about SENCOs. And that's a really important point to make, because again, you know, what's reflected here in the framework, it's about a whole school approach. A whole school approach is going to be much more effective than the SENCO just trying to do it by themselves. And again, I'll come back to what the leadership and management judgment says around this in a minute. So that first bullet point there, whether leaders are ambitious for all pupils with SEND. Leaders, SENCO, yes, absolutely, but also head teacher, other senior leaders, governors, and also middle leaders. Within this framework, there is a lot more focus on middle leadership. So just as an example to sort of highlight that, a couple of schools that I work with that have been inspected recently, the inspector asked the following question: how do you know that your curriculum is ambitious enough for pupils with SEND? Good question, obviously focusing on that, on the curriculum, because that's so important. Yeah. How do you know that your curriculum is ambitious enough for pupils with SEND? That question was asked in one example, which was a primary school, was asked of the SENCO. It was then asked separately of the head teacher. It was then asked separately of the literacy coordinator. In another example, in a secondary school, again, the question was asked of the SENCO, it was asked of the head, and it was also asked of the head of maths. So you can see that actually what Ofsted are doing is trying to triangulate their evidence and establish whether all leaders in the school have got the same message and are, if you like, working on the same page. And that, you know, that goes across all aspects of the framework, all aspects of the curriculum, and it includes, you know, what we're establishing in terms of ambition for our pupils with SEN. What I'll do is to talk a little bit more about some of these other bullet points in a bit more detail later on. I just want to show you the rest of that paragraph and the other bullet points on there. So the next one, how well leaders, again, include pupils with SEND in all aspects of school life. That top bullet point is quite an interesting one. It is quite sad to admit, but over the Christmas holidays, one of the things that I did was actually to read about 50 Ofsted reports from schools that had been inspected under the new framework. And the reason I did that was to try and pull out some of the common themes that were coming out of the reports around SEN. And actually this was one of them. So that involvement of pupils with SEND in all aspects of school life, you know, the curriculum, extracurricular activities, what's happening at non-structured times such as lunch times and break times, how effectively pupils with SEND are being involved in things like residentials and school trips. that actually came up quite a lot in a number of the reports. So, it's definitely something that Ofsted are focusing on. That next bullet point there, how well the school assesses learning and development of pupils, and looking at outcomes within the 4 areas there. Again, I think this is really good that Ofsted have actually put this within the framework, because in a sense what it's doing is to reflect the fact that Ofsted acknowledge not every child with SEN is the same. So yes, a child that has a cognition and learning difficulty, for example, in terms of their starting points, that they might be different. A child with physical need, in terms of what they can achieve academically. We may need higher expectations for some of those pupils. So actually what Ofsted are doing is taking into consideration, in a way, the 4 broad areas of need within the code of practice, because that's what they reflect. And then that last bullet point there, how well pupils with SEN are prepared for their next steps, whether that's going on to further or higher education, whether they're going into employment or training, and then also how, as schools, we are preparing them to, for some of those wider outcomes, if you like. And this really links to how we are preparing young people for adulthood. So, for example, how effectively they are in terms of being able to live independently, participate in society, and be healthy young adults. So those are the key bullet points. As I say, paragraph 312, really important one to get your head around, and we'll come back to some of those a little bit later on. So if we go into the leadership and management judgment here, if we look at the criteria within the handbook for leadership and management, this is the first bullet point. Leaders have a clear and ambitious vision for providing high quality, inclusive education and training for all. Again, it's really strong. It's there right at the start of the criteria around inclusion and inclusive education. So what I would just ask you to reflect on it at this point is this question here. What is your vision for children and young people with SEND in your school? So what do you want provision and outcomes to look like for children with SEND in a year's time, in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time? And if you've got a really clear vision, is that a vision that's shared with other leaders and with governors? Just as a little aside here, I was doing a review in a school not that long ago, just before lockdown actually, and as part of that review I asked the question around vision and what's your vision. I asked the question to the SENCO and then asked it later on in the day to the head teacher, and I got really articulate responses from both of them, but actually they weren't the same. And what had happened was that the SENCO was relatively new to the school and had not had that opportunity to sit down with the rest of the senior leadership team and talk about, what that vision was and how it linked to the whole school vision, and how as a school strategically they were going to move towards that vision. So having that shared vision is really important. How is that vision? If you do have a clear vision, how is it actually articulated to other people? Is it there in your policy? Is it there in other school policies? And in terms of what that looks like in relation to implementation, is that then reflected within your SEN Information Report? Now, your SEN Information Report, obviously for all maintained schools and academies, you have to have an SEN Information Report on your website, and as part of the pre-inspection information that Ofsted will gather, they will look to see if your SEN Information Report is on your website and if it's up to date and if it's been reviewed. So one of the things that's really important to do, and this is to some extent, this is something that you can start doing now, But then also follow up when schools are kind of back to normal. Have a look at your SEN Information Report. Make sure it's on your website and that it's easy to access. Make sure that it's compliant so that it includes all of the regulations that it should do as specified in the SEND Regulations 2014, and that includes a link to the local authority local offer, and check that it has been reviewed, because it needs to be reviewed annually. The important thing is that it's accessible for parents, because they are the predominant audience, and also it's a really good opportunity for you to be able to celebrate good practice in your school as well. Now, in terms of that accessibility for parents, best way to make sure it's accessible, involve parents in its review. The two links that I've put on the bottom of the screen there are links to SEN Information Reports to 2 schools. They are both primary schools, but they're really worth watching, because you kind of get the idea. And what they've done is to put together a video as part of their SEN Information Report, where they've got staff from the school, they've got parents, and they've got children talking about the SEN offer within the school. And it's just a really nice, accessible way of presenting that information to parents. So your SEN Information Report, yes, it's there for parents. They need it to be accessible, but also Ofsted will look at it to make sure it's there. So it's important to check. Just going back to the handbook. Here's just a little bit of information taken directly from the handbook in terms of how Ofsted will gather and record evidence in terms of SEN. Again, it talks about the curriculum, excuse me, and evaluating evidence of the impact of that curriculum. And inspectors will look at acquisition of knowledge and skills, both in lessons, so if you like the mainstream lessons, and then any on-site separate provisions. So if, for example, you have an inclusion base as part of your school provision, where you might withdraw students for certain periods of the day to do small group intervention work or one-to-one work, Ofsted will want to have a look, obviously, at what's happening in there, and that what the impact of that provision is. And also, if you are using any off-site alternative provision, again, they will ask questions around that. So, for example, what's the communication like with the staff from the alternative provision? How do you know what the quality of the offer of that provision is if it's off-site? How are you ensuring that there is effective safeguarding in that off-site provision when your students are accessing it as well? So inspectors will also look at school records and documentation, for example, around the welfare and safety of any pupils who are accessing any sort of alternative provision. Okay, so let's go on to looking at quality of education, because as I said before, this is, if you like, the key judgment, particularly in terms of what Ofsted will consider in relation to the curriculum. As I mentioned, there are, if you like, those 3 key aspects of the curriculum: the intent, the implementation, and also the impact. Just going back to the Ofsted reports that I was talking about before, and having had a look through many of them over the Christmas holidays and since then, I've just pulled out some of the sorts of comments that Ofsted are making in reports, specifically around the curriculum and the curriculum for pupils with SEND. And the 4 at the top there that are in green are the positive comments, and then the red ones which are not quite so positive. So Ofsted are making reference to how well the curriculum is catering for pupils with SEND. If that curriculum is ambitious, and I'm going to keep coming back to that word ambitious and ambition again and again, because it's peppered throughout the Ofsted framework. What leaders are doing to ensure that pupils with SEND are taking part in curriculum offer, how the curriculum is effectively planned and adapted, how pupils with SEND access the wider curriculum. So lots in there around the curriculum offer. In terms of the quality of education judgment around intent of the curriculum, again, it's about that ambition, particularly for disadvantaged pupils and pupils with SEND. So, there's a real focus here on this group of pupils that we're talking about, and the cultural capital, and I'll come back to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So, in terms of this idea of an ambitious curriculum, lots of schools have been asking me this question, well, actually, what does an ambitious curriculum for pupils with SEND actually look like? And, how do we know that we're providing it? How can we provide it more effectively? When OFSTED were putting together their framework, they came up with a list of 25 indicators for an effective curriculum. And what I've done is to take some of the statements from that document that was published and identify the ones which are particularly relevant to an inclusive curriculum, and then reworded them slightly. So in a sense, what I've done is to come up with what I think are 10 key aspects of an ambitious curriculum for pupils with SEND. These 10 questions, I've gotten a bit of a kind of an evaluation sheet, and I can send those to Claire to give to you so you've got them as a handout if you want to use them and share them with other staff, which a lot of my schools have been doing recently. So let's just go through a couple of these bullet points. What's it look like? Well, first of all, there are a full range of opportunities for students. So that includes things like having various curriculum pathways for students, maybe for whom some of the more typical Progress 8 related subjects are not necessarily going to be the most appropriate or relevant for those students. And yes, obviously Progress 8 is still there as a measure, even though obviously this year will be a little bit different. But having said that, this is about what's appropriate and relevant for those individual students, not just what's going to look good in some kind of accountability table for the school. Is a curriculum planned and adapted to ensure that there's that sequence of progression for pupils? And actually, does the curriculum acknowledge the fact that the starting points for some students will be different to others? Particularly for those students who may have cognitive needs. Does the curriculum prioritise reading and vocabulary? And for me, this actually links with point number 4 there, around being knowledge rich and enabling students to develop essential skills and cultural capital. Because for me, part of that development of cultural capital is giving students opportunities to access a really broad and rich vocabulary, and because that really does open students up then to be able to access a full curriculum offer, because reading and vocabulary is so important. Number 5 there, curriculum focuses on improving long-term memory and considers cognitive load theory. Now this relates specifically to OFSTED's definition of learning that they are using within the current framework. So they're talking about learning being defined as an alteration in long-term memory. If nothing's altered in long-term memory, then actually nothing's been learnt. And this definition that OFSTED have chosen to use links to the simple model of memory. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, but just as a bit of a reminder, there's been some criticism about OFSTED's use of this model because it is simple, but having said that, I quite like it because I think it's helpful to have things which are relatively simple. The idea of this model is that, if when we come across something new as a learner, then actually initially that stimulus will go into our sensory memory. So for example, if we come across a new word that we haven't come across before, either because we see it written down or because somebody says it to us, it will go into our sensory memory. That's very, very brief, yeah, up to 1 second only. If we then don't pay attention to it, it's lost, and we might not even realise that we've actually perceived it in the first place. However, if we do attend to it, then it will go into our working memory. Our working memory, again, is quite limited, and it's short. So that information will only tend to stay in there up to about 20 seconds, and we can only hold a certain amount of information within our working memory. If we want to be able to remember that learning, we need to be able to transfer it into our long-term memory, and then to be able to retrieve it from the long-term memory. And so this is really what OFSTED is referring to here in terms of that transference, because we can teach our learners something. We can think that they've learnt it because they may be able to tell us about it initially, immediately. But actually, if we ask them again about it a month later, a week later, even a few hours later, if it's not gone into their long-term memory, they won't remember it, and therefore they can't use it, therefore it hasn't been learnt. So just going back to this idea of, kind of long-term memory, it's important that our teachers understand the implications of this model of memory, and it's particularly important to understand the implications of this model of memory on some of our learners with cognitive needs. Now, if we link what we've just been talking about to cognitive load theory, now cognitive load theory proposes actually that as humans, we can only hold so much information at one point in time in our working memory. And if we overload that working memory, then actually that learning is not going to be transferred into the long-term memory, and we're not going to have learnt it. Now, that's the case for everybody as a learner, but it's even more significant for some of our learners who have poor working memory capacity to start with. And if we consider our students who have cognitive difficulties, and perhaps some of those students who have communication needs as well, probably 80 to 90% of those learners will have poor working memory capacity, and therefore cognitive load theory is even more important in terms of some of the implications. So I suppose what I'm saying here is there's a really nice link with that definition of learning in the OFSTED framework, that we can be really sharing with our teachers and making sure they understand the implications for some of our learners with SEND, and helping them in terms of their teaching practice in relation to supporting working memory. And that little reference that I've put down there at the bottom of the slide, the classroom guide by Gaffer Cole and Alloway, is a really useful one for teachers, and if you just Google that, you'll be able to download it for free. The other thing I just wanted to mention as well, because I think it's quite a useful document, the importance of use of memory strategies is also mentioned in this document here. As you can see at the top of the screen, I referred to this as the SEN support document because it's got the longest name ever, and I can never remember the whole of the title. This is a document that was published by the DFE in 2018, and part of what it includes is the evidence base around high quality teaching for pupils with SEND. And so it looks at some of these common strategies that are particularly effective as part of high quality teaching for our learners with SEND, in particular those who are receiving SEN support. I won't go into all of these now, but just to say that it's a really useful document to have a look at, and again does make that link with the OFSTED definition of learning. So just going back to that ambitious curriculum for pupils with SEND and what it looks like, these are my next 5 points. It starts with high quality teaching. That's just, again, links very much with what the research in this document is saying. all of these particular strategies that it's talking about are part and parcel of high quality teaching. It's not about having lots of extra additional interventions. The priority needs to be about high quality teaching, because first and foremost, that's what's going to make the difference. So it's about what's happening in the classroom, not something that's if you like, sort of bolt on. Ambitious curriculum involves an appropriate and effective use of high quality resources. That includes the use of additional adults where you have teaching assistants, and I know they are becoming even more scarce now, unfortunately, for a number of reasons, mainly financial. But in a sense, that makes it even more important that where we do have that really important of additional adults, that we use them as effectively as we can. An ambitious curriculum also involves using reliable assessments. So assessments that actually genuinely show what students know, what they can do and understand. And those assessments might look slightly different in the way that they're presented to students than to other students, in order for us to really get to understand what students with SEN know. An ambitious curriculum also considers the fact that individuals have different starting points and that progress is relative to those starting points. So yes, we can look at attainment in terms of where students are and you know, how they compare with national expected levels of attainment, but actually for many of the students that we work with, progress is a much better measure of the impact of our curriculum, you know, whether that's progress within maths and English, whether it's progress in other areas that are important to that young person, you know, whether that be about developing their independence, whether it be about developing their social skills or their communication skills, because that's about that holistic approach. Just wanted to flag this document up to you, just in case you hadn't seen this, because this links quite nicely. I'll just come back to that in a minute. This links quite nicely to bullet point 10 there, enabling learners to be ready for their next stage of education, employment or training. I'm sure you'll be familiar with the Gatsby benchmarks that were published, I think it was around about 2014 now, which looked at the information and guidance around careers, curriculum and careers guidance for young people. And what they produced, I think it was in about 2018, was a similar document, taking the Gatsby benchmarks, but actually then adapting those to be relevant for young people with SEND. So what this particular document does is to, if you like, give a list of really useful information and guidance and criteria around supporting young people with SEND in terms of that curriculum and careers guidance. Won't go into detail about that now. If you do want to have a look at that, as I say, just Google it, you'll be able to find that. But in terms of that link with OFSTED and the framework and how you are showing evidence, again, back to that number 10, around enabling learners to be ready for their next stage of education, employment or training. You know, if you can show evidence actually that you've got some of these things in place, then that's really good evidence that you are helping to prepare your young people for whatever they go on to do next. So just going back to the handbook, again, this is taken directly from the OFSTED handbook, and this is the criteria for looking at the impact of the curriculum in that broader quality of education judgment. This isn't all of the bullet points, by the way. These are the ones, again, that are more relevant, if you like, to the learners that we're talking about. So the key factors when OFSTED are looking at and evaluating the impact of the curriculum, actually the key focus is going to be in terms of what pupils have learnt as a result of a well-constructed and a well-taught curriculum. Whatever that might look like for that particular individual or group of individuals. I think bullet point 3 there is really important. National assessments and exams are useful indicators of pupils' outcomes, but they only represent a sample of what pupils have learned. Again, for some of our young people, particularly those with education, health and care plans, we know that actually for them, GCSEs might not be the most appropriate thing. And actually for some of them, if by the end of Key Stage 4, they are able to live in an independent way because they've learned how to cook a meal, because they've learned how to handle money, because they've learned how to use public transport, for them, those are important outcomes. And if they've managed to achieve those things because they were part of the long-term outcomes on their EHCPs, then actually that's successful impact. And again, having evidence of all of these things to show Ofsted are really important. So, for example, one way that you can do that is to have a kind of case study approach for some of your young people with EHCPs that show, this is where the child was at, this is the provision we put in place, these are the outcomes that the child has achieved by the time they leave us or at this point in their education. Now, Ofsted don't expect case studies to be done. They won't necessarily ask for case studies. However, I still think it's quite a useful approach for schools to have something to hand, to have something ready where you can just tell that story of some of your students. And if you're inspected when Ofsted come in, even if they don't ask for that information, just give it to them anyway, because it's, for me, it's really good evidence of the impact that you're having and the impact that your curriculum is having on some of our young people with more complex needs. I'm just going to make a point about that last bullet point there. If pupils are not able to read in an age-appropriate level and fluency, they will be incapable of accessing the rest of the curriculum and will rapidly fall behind their peers. A lot of schools have asked me the question around intervention and what Ofsted's views are on intervention. I think what I would say to that is that, again, go back to a point I made earlier. High quality teaching has got to be the priority. That's the starting point for meeting the needs of any child, whether they've got SEN or not. And as a SENCO, when you're strategically looking at provision across your school, that's where your priority needs to be. However, there will still be students who do require that bit more of a small group or even one-to-one intensive focus on developing key skills. And that's where intervention comes in. So I suppose what I'm saying is that what Ofsted will be expecting is lots of focus on high quality teaching. And yes, intervention is fine, providing that it's focused and it's focused on ensuring that students develop some of those key skills to enable them to access the rest of the curriculum and to access high quality teaching. And in a lot of cases, those key skills are going to be around reading, basic numeracy skills, and then also things like social skills and communication skills as well. So in a sense, that's where your justification for interventions will come in. High quality teaching first, students access intervention, but for a short period of time only, so that they can develop those key skills to get them back into accessing the rest of the curriculum and accessing the high quality teaching that's in place. So just to kind of summarise really what we've been talking about, and to think a little bit more about how you can actually prepare, if you like, for inspection. As I said before, actually the best way to prepare is to be continually self-reflecting, self-evaluating school. So as a SENCO, what you will want to make sure as part of your strategic role is that you are regularly evaluating the policy and the practice that's in place. So, for example, reviewing your policies, reviewing any guidance that you have for staff or for parents, in terms of supporting pupils with SEN. Working with curriculum leaders to make sure that the curriculum is inclusive and accessible. And this is really important, particularly at this point in time, where schools have and will continue to spend a lot of time developing and reviewing and revising the curriculum, and the important role that middle leaders, that subject leads will play as part of that. So that's perhaps something to consider. Again, might be something you want to start now, might be something to focus on hopefully when we get back to normal in the autumn term, and thinking about how as a SENCO you can work perhaps more closely with some of your curriculum leads and your subject leads to make sure that whatever they're putting in place, it takes that inclusive approach, and that there is appropriate progression there for some of our learners with SEND. Obviously, doing things like learning walks, observations, looking at work samples will help you to get an idea, an overall idea of the quality of provision. Some schools have started to do the deep dives in the way that OFSTED will do, as a very, very important part of the inspection process, where they will focus in detail on one particular aspect of the curriculum. And as part of that deep dive, they will be looking at, what the provision for children and young people with SEN looks like. So, for example, if they're doing a deep dive in science, they'll look at what's the curriculum provision for pupils with SEND, how is the curriculum accessible, and is there any specific additional provision that's put in place for pupils who may be not making the kind of expected progress that other pupils are making. Discussions with all stakeholders, really important, particularly those discussions with pupils and parents and other staff. And again, at this moment in time, where you've still got access to some of the students, perhaps because they're still in school, or because if you're having regular conversations with them, that's just really important, because it's continuing to develop those relationships and maintain those relationships with some of our most vulnerable youngsters. And as part of that, start to have those discussions around the curriculum. Ask young people what they think about their normal English lessons, or their normal art lessons, or their normal geography lessons. And make sure, as I said before, that you're thinking about how you're involving other staff in this process of evaluation, particularly how you're involving other senior leaders, and now also how you're involving your subject leads when you're looking at that review of curriculum provision. So just to kind of finish, I just want to show you this, and again, this is something that I can give to Claire so she can send out to you, so you've got a copy of this in a Word document. This is a form that I've been using with a number of schools, again, just really to help them to think about preparation for OFSTED. But the important thing about this is that it's not just something which you as a SENCO would be doing. Actually, it's something that, again, you want to do as part of your whole school response. So the idea is that there are 10 key questions for you and your leaders to consider. And these 10 key questions relate to those bullet points that I showed you before in paragraph 312 of the framework. So that really important section that I mentioned, that's got the elements that Ofsted will be looking for specifically in relation to send practice across the school. So as I say, we talked about these earlier, so I won't go through them, but how schools have used this particular format is, as I say, sat down as a leadership team, looked at each question and thought about what their school response would be if they were asked that question by an Ofsted inspector. Whether that's as a SENCO, a head, another senior leader, a middle leader, or even as a governor. And also to identify what the evidence would be. So if Ofsted asks you the question, how well do leaders in the school identify and assess and meet the needs of pupils with SEN, you've got a response, but then they may also ask, how do you know? So actually, what's your evidence for that? And going through this as a process with other leaders is really useful, because it does help you to prepare for that inspection, but also it might help you to identify, the answer to those two key questions we talked about earlier. What's working well in your school and where there might be some gaps. So those are the first 5 questions, and then the next 5, again, related directly to those bullet points in paragraph 312 in the Ofsted handbook. So as I said, I will share those with Claire, so you can use those, and it might be something that as a group of SEN coach you want to look through together, and then take away and share with your leaders. I just wanted to share some resources that are available. So, I talked about this idea of being a continually self-evaluating, self-reflecting school, and what I've got here are some tools that are freely available to all schools that you can use to support you in that review process, in that reflection process. All of these tools have been produced by Whole School SEND. If you're not familiar with Whole School SEND, they are a consortium of a national consortium of SEND organisations that were given a workforce grant by the DfE a couple of years ago, and have been using that grant to provide information, guidance and publications for schools around SEND and SEND leadership. One of the things that they've produced is this suite of review guides, which, as I say, schools can download, use them as they are, adapt them, entirely up to you. So within the suite of review guides, if we start at the bottom, the SEND reflection framework is a self-evaluation guide that's been developed specifically for teachers. So the idea of that, the idea of all of the review guides really, is that they're broken into sections, and within each section there are a series of statements for practitioners to reflect on and identify, again, what's working well, where are the areas for development. In the SEND reflection framework, one of the sections, for example, is around teaching and learning. So the idea is that classroom teachers can reflect on those statements and think, yeah, this is something actually that's really good practice in my classroom, or no, this is something that maybe I need a little bit more support with. Moving on to the school-wide ones, right in the middle we've got the SEND review guide. Now that, in a sense, is probably the one that best reflects what we've been talking about today, because the idea of that is that you use it to review the whole of your school provision around SEND. And again, it's broken into different sections and looks at things like leadership, teaching and learning, identification, partnership with parents. The Teaching Assistant Deployment Guide, it has been developed, it's based around the work that the Institute of Education did on effective deployment of teaching assistants and the MITRE project. So if, looking at teaching assistant deployment, once we go back to school, is something that's a priority for you, you might want to look at that one. The Preparing for Adulthood from the earliest years is particularly useful for that focus on some of those wider holistic preparing for adulthood outcomes that we were talking about earlier, and what as a school you're doing to support young people towards those outcomes. And then the one above is the SEND Governance Guide. So that's for governors to reflect on how effectively they're carrying out their role in terms of monitoring SEND across the school. The one at the top is for multi-academy trusts, so for leaders who work, who've got responsibility for SEND across a group of schools, and then that reflection framework is for them. So a whole suite of publications that you can, as I say, download and use how you want. And that one in the middle, the SEND Review Guide, is probably the most relevant to what we've been talking about today. I'm just going to go back to where we started really, and think about these 5 key areas that I mentioned earlier on, because it might be, yes, you might use that SEND review guide that Whole School SEND have provided, or it might be that actually you think, I'll use these 5 areas and think about these 5 areas and identify what's working well and where the areas for development are within each of these 5 areas. And as I said, these are the 5 areas that I personally find useful, and these are the ones that I use when I'm doing reviews with schools. So we've talked about the OFSTED framework. Hopefully I've highlighted for you what some of the, the key aspects of the framework are in terms of SEND, and how you can start to, if you like, prepare for any inspections that might happen in the future. But the important thing again is to come back to this point of, best way to prepare for you to be at that self-reflecting, self-evaluating school, and always to keep in mind and to have the evidence of what are your key strengths in terms of SEND, and what are your areas for development and next steps. And out of that, you should then be able to develop a strategic development plan for SEND. And again, just coming back to that point about preparing for OFSTED, having an action plan, having a development plan is a good way of preparing, because actually it shows that, not everything's going to be perfect. Of course, it's not. Every school has things to work on. But what your development plan shows is that you've identified your next steps, and you've identified what you're going to do in order to try and address some of those next steps. Just one more thing I want to show you, because it's a tool that a number of schools now have found really useful, is this thing that we call SEND in a nutshell. And again, this is something that was developed with a colleague of mine, Malcolm Reeve, when we both worked with a very large multi-academy trust, and we asked all of our schools to produce one of these. And well, it kind of does what it says on the tin, really. It's SEND in a nutshell in our school. It's broken down into 4 different areas. So in the yellow section, we've got information about identification of SEND within the school, and also how that compares to national. And that's really useful information to have, because you can use that to sort of strategically plan provision in place in your school, and also to start to ask questions around your identification processes. In the blue box at the bottom, we've got some key outcomes data there in terms of exclusions, attendance, and progress 8 and attainment 8 data. Then in the red box, we've got some examples of high quality teaching and additional interventions across each of the 4 broad areas of need, and also some examples of impact there. And then in the green box, that's really a summary of the school's self-evaluation process. So summary of the key strengths that they've identified in their school for SEN and the key areas for development. We've also got a quote there from a student. We did have a quote from a parent as well. That seems to have disappeared from the green box, but hopefully you get the idea. Now the purpose of this is that it gives you that picture of SEN on one page, and it's really useful to share. It's useful to share with other senior leaders. It's useful to share with governors, and if appropriate, might also be useful to share with OFSTED. And I certainly know of a number of schools that I work with that have used this and have shared it with OFSTED, and have just found it a really useful tool to be able to talk through that summary of SEN provision within their school. So again, that in terms of that template, I'll share that with Claire, and if any of you think that might be useful for you to develop for your school, please feel free to use it. Okay, so that's the end of the session. I hope you found it useful. As I mentioned right at the start, if any of you have got any questions that have arisen from watching the webinar, please pass those questions on to Claire, and then I will try and respond to those questions at some point. Thank you very much.